Today, in this series of modeling for beginners, we're going to be learning how we can move, scale and rotate our objects inside a Blender. First of all, if we want to select our object, I'm going to make sure I'm in object mode, which is this button up at the top here, and I'm going to left click the object which I want to move. You'll notice how a highlight will come around our object like this, which means it's selected. Moving our objects in Blender is very simple, as I covered it briefly in the last tutorial. To do it, we just press G, and you can think of it as G for grab, as I'm grabbing hold of this object, and then when I move my mouse, you can see the object moves with it. The only problem with this though is if I press G to grab it and then move it over here, for example, you can see how things might get a little bit difficult to position in 3D space. I'll press Ctrl Z, which is our undo command, to return it to the center. First of all, if we want to grab something, we can choose a specific axis in order to move it across. If an axis sounds scary, don't worry, it's actually very simple. This green line, for example, is our y-axis, and if you ever forget, just look at this little gizmo here. You can see it labels which color means what. We also have a red line here, which represents the x-axis, which you can see is going this way here. And we have a z-axis, which we can't actually see a line for in the viewport, but is going up and down, as indicated by this gizmo here. There is actually a way to turn on the z-axis in the viewport if you would like to. To do that, you can just come up to these two circles here, left click the arrow, and turn on Z in the axes button. Now, how can we actually go about moving our object on one of these axes, and why is it useful? Well, the main reason it's useful is because it's a little bit easier to understand how we're moving something in 3D space that way. So let's try and move it on the y-axis first, which is that green line there. To do that, all I need to do is press G for grab, and then I'm going to choose Y, which is going to allow me to move it across the y-axis. Notice after I've pressed Y, the green line has become brighter, indicating that it's now moving across that green axis. I'll move it over to here, and when I'm satisfied with its position, I can just press left click. Again, if you want to return it to the last position, you can just press Ctrl and then Z to return it. You can also, if I press G and then Y again, and I'm not happy with this position and want to return it, but without left clicking to position it first, I can press right click just to immediately return it to where it was. This only works while you're still deciding where you're positioning your object while moving it. And this will work with rotate and scale as well. Scale is just changing the size of the object. Let's try and move it across the x-axis this time. I recommend pausing the video and trying to guess for yourself how it would work. If you guessed that it was pressing G and then X, you're correct. That will allow us to move it across the x-axis. Then, of course, as you might have guessed, if we press G and then Z, we can now move it along this blue axis as well. I'll press right click to return. That's handy to know, but what if I want to move it across two axes at the same time? For example, maybe I want to move my object over to here where my mouse is, but I don't want it to go up and down while I do it. Well, to do that, I could move it on only the X and Y axis. And to do that, we need to exclude a certain axis from our movement. I'll press G, and rather than choosing one of my axes and moving it one at a time, I can press Shift Z, and you'll notice how both the red and the green line have become brighter. And what Shift Z does is it's pretty much saying move it on all of the axes apart from Z. And now if I move it over here and then rotate, you'll notice it hasn't moved up and down at all. This of course will work with any combination. For example, if we only want to move it on the green line and the blue line, I want you to think about what we would press. If you guessed that we would press G and then Shift X, because we're excluding that red line, which is the X-axis, you're correct. We can then move it here and press left click, and notice how it hasn't moved on the X-axis at all. I recommend playing about with moving your object, and then once you're comfortable with moving your objects, we'll move on to rotation. To rotate, all we need to do is press R with our object selected, and you can see that's going to allow us to rotate our object like this. If you press R again, that's going to allow you to have a little bit more control over our rotation. So R for basic rotation, and you can press R again, or you can think of it as pressing R twice for a little bit more of an easier time while rotating. I'll right click and then I'm going to press Ctrl Z to return its rotation. If I want to rotate it in, let's say, this direction here, so spinning in its center like that, we can press R and then Z, and that's going to allow me to rotate it around the Z axis. This of course will work with your other axes, so I can press R and then X, and that's going to allow me to spin around this red line here. I want you to think about how we would get it to spin around the green line. If you guessed that would be R and then Y, you're correct. You can of course rotate on only the Y and X axis by pressing R and then Shift and then Z, and that's going to only allow you to rotate across this X and Y axis, which ironically is actually going to make it so it only spins on the blue axis. But that's just the nature of how rotation works, so don't stress on it too much. Let's say though I rotate my object a bunch and I've done a bunch of other actions and I can't press Ctrl Z to return it to its default. Thankfully, there's some built-in tools to help you with both resetting rotation, scale, and movement. To reset rotation, all I need to do is hold down the Alt key and then press R. And you can see that that's now reset the rotation. So think of it as Alt for reset. I can also do this for my grab as well, so I can press Alt and then G, and you'll notice it's now going to return it to the center where it first originated. If you know what applying the scale, rotation, or location is in Blender, once you do this, that will become the new resetted point. If applying transforms is a new concept to you, please ignore that previous statement for now. Finally, let's talk a little bit about scale. Scale is pretty much just adjusting the size of an object. If I press S, you'll notice it's going to allow me to make my object bigger or smaller as I move my mouse. Again, we can choose a certain axis to scale our object on. So I could press S and then Z, for example, to make it taller on just that Z axis. I can also press S and then X to scale it on just that X axis. And I can also exclude a certain axis, so I could press S and then Shift Z, and that would allow me to scale it on just the X and Y axis. And if we want to return our object to its default scale, you can press Alt and then S to return it like that. The final thing I want to talk about is how we can rotate, scale, and move things a little bit slower, which is good for getting some precision. So if I press the G key and move my object, right now you can see it's moving quite fast as I move my mouse. But if I want to do this slower, I can hold down Shift while doing this, and you'll notice that I have to drag my mouse a lot more to move my object. This may be annoying in some cases, but very handy in others. So it's useful to keep this option in mind for a little bit more flexibility while modeling or just moving your objects in general. And as I mentioned, if I press S and then hold down Shift, this will work with scale as well, and of course rotation. But yeah, that just about covers the basics of transforming objects in object mode in Blender. Transforming is just that rotation, scale, and grab that I was talking about. If you're enjoying this series, make sure to check out the playlist here so you can take yourself from a beginner in Blender to an expert in all the 3D modeling tools you need to know. Apart from that though, I'd like to thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.